cartoons. Ever heard of them? I'm sure I'm not alone in the experience of waking up as a 7-year-old on a Sunday morning, going downstairs and watching SpongeBob for 10 hours straight. If I am, I guess I look pretty lame right now. But as a child, I was incredibly blind to all of the subtle adult references that were sprinkled all throughout my favorite shows, one of which, Scooby-Doo, produced in 1969, originally the dopest time to be smoking marijuana. This is pretty clear, with the character Shaggy. I'm sure you're familiar at this point that he is one of the biggest stoners in the entire history of ever.
Sleep nothing. I'm fixing me a super shaggy sandwich. Like, wow, my favorite. A double, triple-decker sardine and marshmallow fudge sandwich. Open the mouth, between the gums. Look out, stomach. Here it comes.
Nobody would make this sandwich unless they were experiencing one of the most serious cases of the weed munchies. So no, a kid would probably never realize this. A kid probably doesn't even know what marijuana is. But looking back as an adult, it is insane to think that something that I spent so much time watching, and therefore had to have been incredibly influential on my development, had a character that was essentially based around the use of this illicit drug. And it's not just Scooby-Doo. So many kids' TV shows are absolutely full of messages like this. And that's something that's really important. TV and movies or whatever kids are exposed to are incredibly influential on them. Something that I recently found out about was after Finding Nemo and Finding Dory came out, kids everywhere were like, oh my god, I want to have Dory as a pet, I want to have Nemo as a pet. It's actually incredibly harmful for the environment because these fish are often captured using cyanide, or instead of just taking the fish themselves, they take entire coral reef heads, which is incredibly harmful for the coral reef environment. And if one or two movies that, blew up in the box office can have that big of an effect on the environment, it's not unfair to say that anything that a kid watches has the potential to be influential in modern society. There are incredibly massive amounts of drug references in visual media that kids are often exposed to. Generally alcohol and nicotine in the form of smoking. And the problem with this is that it's largely glorified in these types of programs, so it's not really like an incredibly accurate depiction of what these substances actually are. The use of these substances is almost always overly glorified for marketing purposes, and it's just not true. So naturally, it leads to increased rates of underage use and abuse of these substances, which is why if there's going to be such large representation of these substances in visual media that kids are exposed to, it's important to have an open dialogue for safety and responsibility in using these drugs. But what's really interesting is when illicit drugs are represented in media, especially shows that are specifically made for kids. And often when kids are exposed to these types of drugs in shows that are made for their age groups, they're not really going to understand what's going on. But there has to be some kind of subconscious effect. Kids are going to glorify the characters in these shows, and in adulthood, they might unintentionally mimic that behavior. There's so many examples of these subversive images of drugs in kids' TV shows. Now, it's hard to say what the effects of these images can have on kids, and there's not a whole lot of research that has been done on it. The closest thing that has been recorded is that there's a positive correlation between watching and seeing marijuana in R-rated movies and marijuana use. But of course, exposure and seeing that it's okay for these glorified characters to do it, I mean, it's gonna make anybody feel like it's more okay for them to do it, regardless of the fact that it's an illicit drug, even though it's like, why is it an illicit drug? But anyways, it's 2019, we'll see where that goes. But in terms of like other drugs, like harder drugs, nobody really wants to talk about it because there's a stigma surrounding most of these drugs, a lot of which are racially charged, but kids don't really know they're watching when they're watching it. They don't know anything about drugs. Nobody's told them about drugs. Nobody sits their kid down at bedtime and they're like, hey, let's see, psychedelics, you want to drop acid? No, nobody does that. Please don't give your kid acid. That's terrible. They don't know what any of this is. That certainly doesn't mean that there aren't underlying effects. I think personally that these kinds of images and kids' TV shows and this exposure, whether they realize what they're watching or not, has to have some kind of effect on their perspective, whether it be on drugs or just in general. And the stigmas against certain drugs are incredibly harmful against minority racial groups because of institutionalized racism. And so if the effects of these TV shows is indeed more open perspectives for kids, and when they grow up and realize the shows they've always glorified were on acid, I mean, of course they'll probably be like, oh yeah, I mean, it's fine, they did it, I can try all these drugs, cool, whatever. Which is, of course, why we need to make sure that we're accurate on our portrayal of these drugs and that there's always an open dialogue about safety and responsibility, as I said before. But it could also potentially lessen the stigmas of these drugs over time, which could potentially lead to the decriminalization of possession of these drugs, helping incarceration rates. And I mean, how do we know that for sure this is going to be the effect of these things? I mean, we don't. Like I said, there isn't a whole lot of research on this topic right now. However, I think it's a very ripe area for study. I think there are a multitude of longitudinal studies that could be done that will showcase the effects of these subversive images. Of course, there are going to be other factors that affect the outcome of the kids watching these shows and whatnot, but I think this could really mean something. Like perhaps a study could be done studying the differences in kids' outlook and behaviors if they had like strict parents that didn't let them watch anything, and you could look at kids that didn't have as strict of parents and see how they feel about things. And there are many other factors that could affect these kids' behaviors and outlooks when they get older. For example, if they had more strict parents, that might be more influential on the reason they have their perspective than the shows they weren't watching. But it's still an interesting idea and an interesting thing to look at, especially when there's so little education for most kids about drugs and their effects and the origins of their stigmas and the effects that their taboos have on people and minority populations especially. I think the best way to make sure you have a lasting impact on the world and society is to influence the younger generations, because ultimately the older generations are going to die off. The boomers don't have much time left. So it's time to do what we can now to set up a better future for the younger generations, because they're the ones that have the power to make the biggest change.